Previously, I showed you how to download and install the Express generator and how to use it to scaffold a Node and Express web application using, in our case, handlebars as the templating framework. And then I walked you through all of the pieces that it created and explained their meaning and use. So now I've gone off and done some development and created some examples of how you would add new routes, new views, and even API endpoints, how to access data that comes in from requests, and how to send it back to the requesting client. The first thing you're probably going to want to do when you do development is configure your environment to actually be able to run and debug your application. So in my case, I'm using Visual Studio Code. It's a pretty new in the world of editors and development environments, but it's built on the same framework as Atom, and it's I'd say it's a real up-and-comer. I like it a lot. It's fast. It has all the features that I need and like. So, if you haven't taken a look at it, maybe give it a try. You might like it too. I'm going to just show you real quick how to configure VS Code to be able to debug and run an application. It's real easy. So you go to this little icon over here. That's the debug tab. It's going to tell you, for starters, that there's no configuration. So we'll just click this and it pops up a little handy chooser. And you can see right now it only has these two environments available. This is kind of the out-of-the-box stuff. I suspect that you can probably get other environments in here by installing extensions and support for other languages, but I haven't done that because I'm doing Node development, so it's real handy for me that Node comes out of the box. If you just choose this, it'll automatically generate a launch.json for you and put it in .vs code folder in the root of the project. And you can see right here, it's actually picked up from the package.json. Remember when I showed the package.json before and it had that script start command? I'll go back over to it. So there it is. So that's how this application is started out of the box, like if you just want to run it with npm. And VS Code has picked that up and is copying that for its config. So now I can actually run this application just by pressing F5. And you'll see up here a toolbar appear, which lets you pause and step in and step out. And this lets you restart the app. So after you've made some changes, you can just click that to restart it. And of course, stop ends debugging mode. And you can see down here, it's showing some output. And if I go over here and I actually go to localhost 3000, it's actually going to start outputting the debugging information down here too. So it's capturing the console output and even colorizing it and showing it. So it's a pretty nice little all-in-one way to be able to work with your application. And of course, just like you'd expect, you can still set breakpoints in your code and inspect variables and all that stuff. I'm not going to show how to do all that. I think it's pretty obvious if you've ever used any other kind of integrated development environment debugger, you know how to do that. So we're not going to waste time on that here. Anyway, that's how you get things started with configuring the environment to debug and run your project. And next, I'm going to show you some fake data that I mocked up, and I'll start showing you some routes and some new views to give you an idea of how you can create your own. So here I've created a module that exposes an interface that looks a lot like a basic repository pattern for a database, except this database is purely in memory and it's really just backed by an array. So I've loaded up some data here with a couple of the Falafel team members, and then down here I've implemented a filter, a get by ID, an insert, an update, and a delete. I want to take just a second and look a little bit closer at filter because you may not have seen some of the syntax before. These some of the new language features in ES6. And I'll admit that my use of the ES6 generator function here is slightly gratuitous. I actually originally implemented the database as a map, which is another new object, built-in object in ES6. But I decided ultimately just to use a simple array because it was a little bit easier to work with for what I'm trying to do for this exercise. So, but when you're working with a map, you don't have, for example, the functions like array.filter or array.map and those kinds of things that you're used to in working with collections with arrays. Those don't exist in map. A map is a key value collection, and the only way that you can access the values is through an iteratable, which is a new concept in ES6. And in that case, then using a generator function to sort of access that, because an iteratable itself is a generator, kind of makes sense. I changed the backing store to an array, and I just decided to leave this filter implementation as is because I thought it was a little bit interesting to look at. So the way this syntax works is a generator function looks exactly like a normal function, except it has this star at the end of it to say that it is a generator function. And what a generator function is it's a function that can yield individual values that the caller can iterate over. Kind of like, it's very similar to what's it called in C Sharp? It's like, okay, in C Sharp, if you have a method that returns an IEnumerable, you can use the yield keyword inside it to yield individual values one at a time. So it's a lot like that. So it's kind of like we're returning an IEnumerable here that you can then iterate over. And you can actually iterate over it with this syntax right here, which is also new to ES6, where you use the let keyword, declare a variable, and then instead of the in keyword, which you're used to from earlier versions of JavaScript, you're using of. So when you say let var of collection, you're saying I want to iterate over the members of that collection. So that's what a caller would also do. They could call filter and then they could do a let, items of, filter, and then iterate through. In my case, I'm actually just going to construct an array out of the iterable and return it. But that's how that's consumed. So now, two interesting things happen here. One, if the query is completely empty, and actually this will bomb out if the query is null, but you'll see in the router where it's being called from, the query is always going to be at minimal an empty object. So that's why this if expression looks the way it does. So you can do two things to yield values from a generator function. You can either yield a scalar, like I'm doing down here, or if you want to sort of like yield another iterable one at a time, then you can use yield star. So by saying yield star falafeldb, which is an array, it's sort of the equivalent of iterating through falafeldb and yielding the contents of that one at a time, except we're just doing it all at once. Now, if I had left the star off the yield, then then instead of yielding back the members of falafeldb, it would have yielded back a single item, which was an array. And we don't want that. We want the members of the array, not the array itself. So that's sort of the difference there. And then down here, we're just doing some basic filtering. It's just doing like a regular expression, string contains like operation on name, title, bio. And then the only one that's kind of interesting is awards. You'll see up here that awards is actually an array that just contains strings. So it's doing the same kind of thing there, just doing some string contains on the contents of awards instead. So this lets us do a few things and just sort of show that you can do like a RESTful API call that can send and receive arrays as well as strings and filter on them. So, of course, you could keep exactly this signature for the module, and then replace the rest of it with access to a relational database, because this is a pretty standard like module pattern, like I said before, of how lots of times you'll isolate the details of the storage from the rest of the application and then just program against that. This, you can kind of think of this, even though it's not formally declared as an interface like it would be in a more typed language, this is your interface that you're programming against, and everything inside here is hidden. So in that way, it is still object-oriented programming, even though it's not strongly typed. So next I'm going to show how this class is going to be used to render views that can return lists of data that are returned from this fake repository, and then also how you would render a view that would be like a detail. Okay, so here's the router that I've created that will serve up data that is in turn going to be rendered by some handlebars views. Now, before I get into the details of how to obtain data from the request and how to render it in the view, I want to talk a little bit about program structure. I've written some blog posts on different ways that you can deal with referencing other modules throughout your Node.js project. The way everything works is everything is kind of based off relative paths. So FalafelDB is over here in data FalafelDB, and I'm over here in roots falafel. So if I wanted to just access that directly, I would have to say const falafelDB equals require, and then I'd have to go, let's see, I'm in roots right now, so I want to go up a level, and then I want to go into data, and then FalafelDB, like that. So I don't really like doing this because it sort of makes your entire project be very brittle or very position dependent. Like I couldn't restructure my project even if I wanted to, easily anyways, because of stuff like this. You really don't want to have absolute paths around. It's just not really a happy thing. So there's two ways that you can avoid that. I've written a blog post on how you can leverage Node's built-in module resolution, where it will actually, if it can't find a match for something, it will actually start looking in Node modules folders in every folder, starting in the current folder. So, I could, for example, if I did a require FalafelDB here, and it didn't find it in the, if it didn't find it in the core Node modules, which of course it wouldn't, then it would actually start in roots Node modules, and it would look for a FalafelDB there. And then if it doesn't find it in there, then it would pop up to the next directory, which would then be just the kind of the root directory for this project, and it would look in the Node modules folder there, which of course you don't really want to be putting stuff in there, because that is a very long list of all kinds of things that were installed by your project's dependencies, and trying to find stuff in that list is just a pain in the butt. Not to mention the fact that VS Code, and I wouldn't be surprised if other editors did this too, actually exclude the contents of Node modules from search results and other things where you might want to have insight into these modules that you have written. And it does that because it knows, or the authors know, that there can be a lot of code in Node modules, and they are trying to save you time by not wasting CPU usage, analyzing all that code that you probably really don't care about the nitty-gritty internals of, for the most part. So while I like the one approach, which is to actually create like a nested folder under the root and put a Node modules there and put all your project modules in there, it's nice in that then everything under there can access those modules simply by name without any path weirdness, having to figure out what the relative path is. But the downside is now you have to configure your editor to, okay, ignore the Node modules at the base of the project, but don't ignore other Node modules folders. And at least right now, VS Code's search exclude syntax is not all that forgiving with that kind of thing. can kind of work, but it's not the best. I'm starting to kind of move away from that because I find that it's at odds with the way the editor was written and how they kind of assumed you'd be using it. So another thing you can do is something that I feel like is pretty nice, which is to inject your dependencies, kind of like you do. You've heard dependency injection in other languages. Well, I feel it works well here, not only because it makes your code more testable, but it can also sort of help you avoid that relative path hell issue. So that's what I've done here. And you can see that actually my module export is not actually exporting a router, but it's rather exporting a function that returns a router. So that lets me actually pass in dependencies that this router is going to need as parameters and create a router and return it. So let's take a look at how that works real quick. I'll go out to app.js here. And you'll see that, okay, in the app.js, I am reaching from this folder downwards into data, FalafelDB. And then I'm passing that in as a dependency to my falafel route. So there is still a little bit of relativity here, but I feel like relative paths are a bit more manageable if you follow the rule that you never navigate upwards and then back down in folders. You always, like, higher level folders can access lower ones, but not vice versa. I feel like that's a bit more manageable. It's easier for me to think about. And in cases like this, I think it really makes good sense. I already have this fake FalafelDB here, but, I could easily, like I discussed previously, we could create another module that actually accesses a real DB, implements the same interface, and pass that into the router instead. And boom, now we have a router that works against a relational database. All right, so we've talked about how you can sort of manage dependencies, stay out of relative path hell. So now let's look at the implementation of this router. This router is pretty simple. It's only implementing two get methods. And before I forget, let's look quickly at that. Okay, so we have our router here, and we're saying router.get. So this method name is the HTTP verb that this route is going to match. So you're going to see in a minute when I do the API routes, you're going to see some other HTTP verbs. So, you can do put and post and delete and all those things. A couple other ones as well that are a little bit less common. But here we're just going to do some gets. So we got one that's going to get the whole team. And we're setting here, this is the page title. And then the data is going to be a filter. So remember that falafeldb.filter, this guy here, exported down here. All right. We're going to pass in what that is. This request.query, that's the query string. So you can see over here right now, we're returning all of the falafels that I typed into my little fake database. But we can put in a query in here, and you can see I already have a couple test queries in there. But we can just do a query for anybody whose title contains master. Oh. It would help if I started this app up first, wouldn't it? All right, let's try that again. There we go. All right, so title contains master, title contains CEO, and so forth and so on. So you can see we've got some basic functionality in here for listing team members and even doing a little bit of querying. Let's go back to team. We can't see the awards there, but we can even filter on awards, remember. So we'll look for everyone who's got some Telerik certifications. Okay, that's me, Lino, and George. And then the next thing I wanted to show right here, this is how Express represents capturing a variable from the URL itself. So anything that's tagged with a preceding colon like this gets put into the request.params object, and whatever label you use here is going to be the name of the property here. So we can go, say we said that Lino, George, and myself all have Telleric awards. Well, I happen to know that Lino is the first person I put into that database. So there he is. There's our team page, or our individual page showing details. And okay, yeah, there's some Telleric awards. So that's how you get information out of the URL. So just to recap, the query string is put into request.query, and anything that's captured from the URL is put into request.params. There's another way, of course, that you can send data, and that's with sending data in the body of the request. That's typically used with APIs, although it can also be used with forms. So I'll show that soon. I just want to mention that this is not the only syntax that you can use here for capturing items out of the URL. It's actually possible to do some fancy stuff like regular expressions and match them right in the query string, or not in the query string, right in the URL. So you have more power and more flexibility than what I'm showing here. I'm just showing the basics. Oh yeah, one other thing I want to show too is another ES6 feature. You notice this might look a little strange if you haven't seen this syntax before, is I'm just saying, constructing an object here, and this first line looks really familiar, right? I mean, that's what you're used to. You put the property name and then you put the value. And then the second one, I'm just putting a variable. Well, this is another new convenience of ES6, and this is a shorthand, meaning just that. It's just nice. I don't know. I like it. There's a lot of things in ES6. If you haven't educated yourself about it here, I'm going to try to call out the few things that I'm using here and there. Obviously, I'm using const all over the place and let. It's got just a lot of great new stuff that will change the way you write your JavaScript. Really nice stuff. I'm not even showing all of it here. I mean, I'm not showing any arrow functions, which are huge. I'm not showing template string literals. So there's other cool things besides what I'm showing here. But the things that I am using that I kind of have gotten into the habit of using, I'll show, or I'll mention as they come up. So I've shown the part of the code in the router that constructs objects and renders them. So now let's take a look a little bit at the handlebars syntax that's being used to render these views. Obviously they're very simple. I didn't style them because we're talking about functionality here. I'm not trying to make an art project. That's what you get with me. I'm an engineer. Alright, so let's take a look at the falafels collection first. Okay, so here we go. Here we have some syntax that shows how to iterate over a list. So if we go back to the router, you'll remember, okay, we put the title. Actually, I hard-coded this title, didn't I? Oh, it's two different titles, right? Okay, so let's go back to the team. Alright, so that's this title. And then up here, this tab, that's actually coming from the layout. This title. So handlebars out of the box, it has sort of an extensible helpers interface, so you can create like your own helpers. This is one of the few that comes out of the box. It's the list iterator, and it's probably, one of the most generally useful. This just lets you iterate over a list. So if you recall, in my, let's go back to falafel.js. So my context object has a data property, which is an array. This one. So the data property is an array, so we're going to iterate over that, and then for every one, we're just doing a little definition list here, and we're rendering out the name and the title. Simple stuff. Then for the detail one, getting a little bit more fancy, but it's really not doing anything that you haven't seen already. So once again, if we look at this, now we're just creating a context that has a title, so that's now that's going to be the page title, and then the data is the data of the individual that we're viewing. So the page title is being used by the layout, and then everything else is in the data object. So we got data.name.title, put a little heading for awards, and we're doing the same thing you saw before with list iterator, and finally show in the bio. So that's the basics. That's how you use some handlebars views and some view context objects and put them together to output some HTML. So next I'm going to show how you can use Express also to create APIs, and that will include how to read data out of the body of the request. So now let's take a look at how you would implement a web API router or controller in Express. So web API controllers generally both read and write JSON data, and unlike in, say, like Web API from .NET Framework, there's no automatic content negotiation out of the box with Express. You can roll your own because you have access to the accept type property in the request object, so you could create a helper function that would, say, take in your data that you generate as a result of the request and takes in the accept type and then gives you back either a rendered view or a JSON body or whatever else based on that. But I'm not going to do that here. I'm just going to show you how to do everything straight up. So the main thing that you haven't seen already out of all this is just how do you read the body of a request. And the main time you need that is for things like when you're doing inserts with the post. So before I was talking about you're going to see some other HTTP verbs. Well, here they are. And we've got our router.get. We've got a delete, which deletes an entity from our little in-memory database. And we got a post, which lets you insert. And you got a put, which lets you do a complete update. You could also listen for patch and do partial updates if you wanted, but I decided not to do that for this little example. So you can see right here, all you got to do to read the body is reference request.body. Now, if you just like installed Express and didn't do anything else, this wouldn't actually work when you tried to post a JSON body. Remember when I did the walkthrough of the Express app before? I pointed out these two lines here, body parser. So this app.use bodyparser.json is what lets Express read and understand a JSON formatted body. And then this URL encoded lets it do the same thing for HTTP form posts. Now, I'm not going to show any form posts here, but it works basically the same as doing a JSON request. So you can see here that you can get team, you can filter just like you could with the HTML view. You can get a single item, and then you can do your CRUD operations there. So I've loaded up Postman here and saved a couple samples just to kind of show how it all works and what it looks like. So here I've just done the basic request that returns everything, so you can see that. And then, you know, you can also, like, remember before I did the request for, I filtered on awards containing Telerik, but then, you know, we just saw like Lino and me and George, but we couldn't really see the awards on that page. Well, there you go. So now we've done the request, and we can actually see in the body of the response because we see everything instead of just the name and title like we saw in the HTML view. So that's all working, and that's using the get verb. If you're not familiar with the Postman interface, this is obviously the URL, and then the verb is over here. So here's an example of how you'd create like a new guy at Falafel. So there's the URL. So you're posting to the team URL. So there's the post verb, and here's our JSON body with a name, its title, and a couple awards, and a little silly bio. So send that, and we'll get back. This is pretty common. I mean, you've probably seen this before. Most repositories when you post, you either get back either the entire created object or you just get back the ID. In this case, since the backing store is an array, it was very easy just to return the ID, so that's what we've done here. So we can take that ID and we can actually do a get of that guy we just created, and there he is. And then if we want to do an update, so here's our put verb over here. We're going to use, remember, this is a complete update, so we're having to replace everything. So we're sending all the stuff, except I've changed his title to senior developer. He got a little bit of a promotion. So we'll send that. And then this one actually just sends back the updated entity. It's another thing that's pretty common in a lot of repository patterns. They'll send back the updated entity because the backing store might have done some additional calculations. There might be columns in the database that have been calculated, or other things may have even changed since the last time you got your data, so it refreshes the data at the same time as you do the update. So now that we've done that, we can go back to the get URL and send it again, and okay, now he's a senior developer. And lastly, you know, maybe a new guy wants to move on, so we'll remove him from the team with a delete. And again, it's pretty common. A lot of APIs will return the deleted item when you do a delete action. So there he is. He got deleted. And now if we do a get of a query of everybody, and we'll see. Okay, he's not there anymore. All right, so that's pretty much it. That's how you read the body. Not a whole lot to it. So from here, I think you have all the basic parts that you need to start creating your own web application. You can render HTML. You can accept requests. You can accept data in the URL, in the query string, and in the body. And you know how to send back data either as a rendered view, or I didn't really call this out earlier, but there it is. That's how you send back a JSON formatted response. So those are all the building blocks you need. So now you can go off and create your own awesome web application using Node.js and Express. Enjoy.